Good morning, everybody, and welcome to my channel. It's called Macduff Lives. I'm John OLoughlin, and this morning I'm on part 4 of my reading of How the Nation Was Won by H. Graham Lowry, America's Untold Story. And I'm trying to tell that story because it's a good story. It's a happy story. It's a story that we can tell our grandchildren if we have any, or if we live that long, in trying to preserve, I guess I almost want to say protect and defend, not just the Constitution, but the idea of the United States, the idea of the Republic of Liberty, with liberty and justice for all, and how that has been under attack ever since it got started. And this book traces the beginnings all the way back to 1620 with the Puritans and their creation of a Puritan republic in Massachusetts Bay, called the Massachusetts Bay Colony, that then became partners with other local colonies. The Winthrops of Massachusetts and Connecticut joined together, and New Hampshire. These colonies joined together in order to have mutual trade and to protect each other. And this was called the New England Confederation, and it existed back from I'm just guessing 1630 or 40 to the end of the James II's rule in 1688 to 1689, the Glorious Revolution, which put the Dutch King William III on the throne of England. So the changes that happened in these New England colonies were all for the bad, in that they had started off with the idea of, we're all human, we're all for each other, we all support each other. It's kind of a community that's not going to be self-sufficient. They acknowledge the sovereignty of the English crown, but not their ability to govern us. I say us, meaning them as our ancestors politically, because these political ancestors of ours, these Puritans, had it in their mind that the empire was why they left. And they didn't want to be part of the empire anymore, that mercantile machine that extracts wealth out of human lives, nature, and animals at an alarming rate, even back then. So people rebelled against the idea that they were stuck in this imperial, kind of like a Borg, really, and they left. And the idea was that they were going to go into the wilderness. Of course, it wasn't exactly a wilderness, was it? But to them, it was a wilderness. It was a spiritual wilderness. And their biblical beliefs taught them that they could go into this, basically what they considered to be a virgin territory, and establish a new world, a world that would be not dependent, not even associated with the machinations of empire represented by the crown of England. So just to put a little background there, because I think this is a difficult story to get people interested in unless you see it as the story, our story, my story, your story, the story that has started then and brought us to this day. So along comes King James II with the Restoration in 1660. And as a result of that, New England is put on the defensive. It's no longer feeling its oats. It's now having to defend by sending representatives to London to try to negotiate the retaining of its original charter, which granted it self-government. And they lost eventually. They lost in 1689, and a royal governor came in and took over. And the chapter that we're reading now, Massachusetts under royal rule, is the story of corruption. It's the story of the success of this fellow named Cook, COO, Elisha Cook, the largest mill owner in Boston, and the other, what he considers the corrupt merchant class. This is Graham Lowry's term. So these corrupt people are now going to take over the government of Massachusetts. And that's where we come to the very important point of religion. Okay? Because it is religion that keeps people in the same sense of morality. You know, if we share what generally was called Christian values back then, which generally, just to me, I just call it the golden rule. You know, treat everybody the way you'd like them to treat you. You know, if you have extra food and they're hungry, give them some food. It's not difficult to find out how the traditional Puritan approach works, but it only works if you have something keeping you together, whether it is going to church on Sundays or reading the Bible together or singing together. These things are important to keep the community energized and believing in each other, to the extent that I can trust you not to take advantage of me if I turn my back. Is my little sack of gold going to disappear if I don't, you know, put it in a bank and buy an insurance policy for it? If I can just leave my door open, you know, as often was the case and still is in a lot of rural areas, that you don't lock your door. Why would you? Your neighbor's not going to steal from you because that's not the way you are. And that's what I'm talking about, a dependence on one's own morality being part of a community morality, that we just don't treat each other that way. We don't cheat. We don't steal. And we don't cross each other's boundaries in so many other ways. So the way that the Puritans saw their relationship with God was different from the way the Anglican Church taught to see your relation with God. Okay? It is the simple difference of whether you have a personal relationship or through Jesus, however, you know, but a personal relationship with your personal contact with God, whether it's Jesus or God or whatever. But you're there. And please don't tangle me up in a bunch of theological stuff. I'm just trying to make a general point that in the Anglican religion, the church actually works under the royalty and is part of the British Empire. Even if they call it the Anglican Church or the Episcopal Church today, you see that St. George's cross on their flag, that's not because they like St. George, it's because they're British. And the hierarchy, whether technically or not, is still a high church attitude. And that's what is at stake in our reading today, which is called the Theological Subversion, where you see what's going to happen is that these people who have founded a community based on personal relationship with God are now going to lose their ministers. They're going to lose their church. It's going to be turned back into an imperial, top-down, ceremonial and directed from above religion. And that is where this particular part of our book is focused. So in Boston, Cook's merchant liberation movement moved into power. The traditional path to the legislature, which had been by proven leadership as a town selectman, but now merchants with no prior elective office began regularly winning seats in the general court. Nathaniel Belcher entered the grain business and within months was reputed to be Boston's leading baker. He was also dependent on Elisha Cook, Boston's leading flour mill owner. Belcher, Cook, Oliver. This is the coterie that started taking away the people's own participation in government and forming an elite circle that can govern to their own particular benefit. The orgy of oligarchical corruption that occurred in Massachusetts following the loss of its Republican charter posed a serious threat to its future. Cotton Mather sounded the alarm in 1696. Massachusetts appeared no longer willing to fight for the great mission begun by its founders. Instead, Cotton Mather declared, there seems to be a shameful shrink in all sorts of men among us from that greatness and goodness which adorned our ancestors. We grow little in every way, little in our civil matters, little in our military matters, little in our ecclesiastical matters. We dwindle away to nothing. The institutions of Puritan New England, protected no longer by an independent government and under frontal attack with the imposition of royal rule, were on the verge of destruction. Republican currents among the intellectual leaders trained at Increase Mather's Harvard were increasingly being displaced, and in 1701, Mather himself was removed from the college presidency. The deviations, however small they might appear today, struck at the core of congregational worship, especially by ending the requirement that communicant status in the church be based on a public account of experiencing God's grace. These democratizing moves were direct steps toward the unleashing of irrationalist fundamentalism, such as has swept over American religious life ever since, substituting emotional manipulation for the enhanced powers of reason nurtured by Augustinian Christianity. Behind this scheme for a more efficient herding of sheep lay a Jesuitical conspiracy to destroy the Puritan congregational model dedicated to generating a Republican citizenry. All right, that's a big sentence, and I'm going to stop and say this is one of the most important points about the Jesuits, okay? They're going to act behind the scenes, behind. But you see how our author picks up on it. Behind this scheme lay a Jesuitical conspiracy to destroy the Puritan congregational model dedicated to generating a Republican citizenry. So to be a Republican citizen, a citizen of a republic, you have to have your own conscience. You have to have a conscience that is related to God. And that means if your conscience is no longer your own and now belongs to higher authority that are going to tell you, then you're no longer fulfilling the mission for which the colony was founded. You're no longer starting something new based on your relationship and your community's relationship with a higher power. You are now reverting to the Anglican Church, which is the imperial church of the British Empire. So I think, I'm listening a lot to George Webb, of course, lately, and looking forward to his show at noon, the Biden Belt and Road Show with the great Wayne Madsen. And I had the pleasure of interviewing Wayne Madsen year and a half ago, back in November of 2019. One of the other things that was taken down when we lost our channel at Macduff, Kennedy's Man to Smash the CIA. But I have the video. I just need to organize it and put it back together so you can once again see those interviews. So looking forward to that at noon with once again our great producer Andy Dybala providing the production and engineering. Well, let's get back to our reading. Theological subversion. New England was not unfamiliar with such assaults on reason and natural law, disguised as, quote, true religion. Against the Republican morality of founding Governor John Winthrop's, quote, on Christian liberty, the mystic Anne Hutchinson claimed, quote, direct revelation from God during the antinomian crisis. There was no need for either education or ministerial guidance in comprehending the teachings of Christianity, she insisted. Instead, whatever felt good was regarded as the truth. Doesn't that sound just like the Tavistock Institute today? And, what was his name? Crowley. Do what thou wilt. It's exactly the same thing. Whatever felt good was regarded as truth. Following the Stuart Restoration, Quakers were introduced to New England in the mode of outright terrorists. Quaker women roamed the streets naked, often with their faces painted black, and broke up congregational meetings by breaking bottles over ministers' skulls as a sign of their, quote, emptiness. During the Cook machine's rise to power, Samuel Sewall recorded another such disruption by Quakers, bursting into a meeting at the Old South Church, an institution which the Brattle Street Church sought to replace. By the time of the Andros dictatorship, the Jesuit threat warned of by John Winthrop was not simply an external one in Puritan New England. The Presbyterians committed to establishing secret governance over the churches by self-perpetuating synods beyond congregational control, were, in the Puritans' minds, a direct variant of Jesuit operations. Significantly, Cotton Mather compared the threat posed by the founding of the Brattle Street Church to the hated Governor Andros's attempt to utterly subvert our churches. Andros was widely accused in Massachusetts of being a secret papist and a collaborator with Jesuit agents in directing Indian attacks against New England. Increase Mather answered the Brattle Manifesto with the Order of the Gospel in 1700, attacking the scheme for the ordination of ministers as threatening to give away the whole congregational cause at once. His suspicions were confirmed by the publication in London a few months later of Stoddard's Doctrine of Instituted Churches. The oligarchical character of the efforts to, quote, democratize New England's churches becomes obvious in Stoddard's arguments. A minister in Northampton in the Connecticut River Valley of western Massachusetts, Stoddard had introduced irrationalist, fundamentalist methods there in 1677 in the wake of the Indian devastations of King Philip's War. He now proposed that not only should communion be automatically offered to anyone attending church, but that the ministry should regard mere participation in communion as leading to salvation, making it a mystical rite rather than an attainment of Christian self-knowledge. Stoddard also sought to redefine the church as nothing more than a group of people assembled by God in the same place, and thus deserving no specific existence. Thus, he argued that the Congregationalist church, coherent with the notion of a qualified Republican citizenry, was without foundation. Instead, the churches should be subjected to Presbyterian governance. with ministers and congregations ruled by synods. Oh, Toto doesn't like that idea. Congregations ruled by synods. Oh my. Lions and tigers and bears. Which would also be free to revise doctrines as they saw fit, rather than adopt the sayings of the ancient fathers. The proposition sounded very much like Charles II's policy towards the Massachusetts Charter. In other words, don't expect us to spell out what you need to do. You just need to do what we want you to do, and if you screw up, we will punish you. Cotton Mather confronted Stoddard at a meeting of ministers in Boston in the summer of 1700. He denounced him for advocating that the churches be ruled by synods from England and for packing the communion table with, quote, those who know themselves ungodly wretches, in order to make us, with our own hands, pull down our own house. In print, Mather also bemoaned the appeal of Stoddard's, quote, wretched novelties to a carnal, giddy, rising generation, and blasted the Presbyterianism that runs down the Connecticut River, unquote. This sort of Jesuitical subversion under the Presbyterian label, parentheses, Mather attacked Stoddard's communion for the unregenerate as a popish fancy, was contained to a degree in Boston. Even Benjamin Coleman, the first minister of the Brattle Church, was brought back into uneasy alliance with the Mathers. Solomon Stoddard, however, had already established methods of breeding the frontier pestilence of backwardness and irrationalism that would remain a crucial problem throughout America's efforts to develop its Western settlements. Wow. Do you see what this is? This is like the Air Force Academy and Pat Robertson and all of John Foster Dulles' World Council of Churches. The idea that he and his type of Calvinist fundamentalism is going to impose its will on all the different Protestant churches. And actually, at this point, are they not all merging into some type of one world religion that's going to be sitting in that big, tall, religious-looking edifice in Kazakhstan, in Astana, where they are going to have the big sun, the big sun in the globe and all. It's just one of those things you see as you research this stuff. Take a look at Astana sometime, and you'll see what I mean. They're going to center the one world church is going to be centered there. Same type of idea, just make people dumb, take away their idea that reasoning is going to be good for you, and just do what you're told. That's how to make us back into medieval serfs. And that, I think, is exactly what was going on when Cotton Mather was trying to save the Puritans from this Anglican assault. But I've never seen this fundamental Presbyterianism identified as Jesuitical. What exactly do we mean by that? Is that a connection between the Knights of Malta and, Spellman and Pius XII? Those Catholics and Allen Dulles and John Foster Dulles and those Presbyterians, do they meet in some Jesuit cloister somewhere secretly and pray together and plot together how to control and eliminate the population of the globe? Is that what they do? They've been doing that a long time. Stoddard's case is exemplary of oligarchical methods. Posing as a, quote, minister of the people, he injected periodic doses of psychotic revivalism into the population of the Connecticut Valley. Otherwise, he basked in the society of the self-styled river gods, the valley's feudalist landowners and trading potentates, who fostered generations of subversion and treason in America. Wow, Connecticut Valley, fostering generations of subversion and treason in America. And then along came Macduff, and he grew up right there in the hotbed of such. Okay, Stoddard brought his own grandson into the soul-saving business in 1727. He was none other than Jonathan Edwards, who used Stoddard's methods as well as his training in Lockean psychology at Yale to lay waste to the whole Connecticut Valley in the Great Awakening revivals of the 1730s. Edwards himself married into the river gods' families and recycled a number of his daughters through them, producing among his own grandsons the infamous traitor Aaron Burr, who later killed Alexander Hamilton and conspired to break up the Republic during the presidency of Thomas Jefferson. Another grandson was the despicable but less energetic Timothy Dwight, a leader of the treasonous Hartford Convention that sided with Britain and advocated secession of New England from the Union during the War of 1812. Edwards himself, in classic Jesuit imitation, spent some of his final years as a so-called missionary to the Indians on New England's western frontier before becoming the president of Princeton, the Presbyterian College of New Jersey. The threat of utter subjection. Besides such subversion from within, the American colonies also faced a determined threat from England to reduce them to complete economic subjugation. In 1696, the new Navigation Act was passed in Parliament. To enforce the policy of restricting trade by the colonies, the king's customs officials were given broad powers of search and seizure and authority to prosecute violators of the act without juries. To better coordinate England's colonial looting, a Board of Trade was established the same year and not abolished until 1782 after the success of the American Revolution. Appointed as one of the commissioners of trade was the wretched empiricist John Locke, the, quote, philosopher, whom so many historians illegitimately describe as the intellectual author of American independence. Locke had returned to England from exile as part of the Venetian baggage of the Dutch invader William of Orange. In 1701, Locke's Board of Trade called for revoking all the colonial charters in America in order to make its lands, trade, and navigation, quote, subject to your majesty's immediate government. The report also charged that, quote, these independent colonies do turn the course of trade to the promoting and propagating woolen and other manufactures proper to England, instead of applying their thoughts and endeavors to the production of such commodities as are fit to be encouraged in these parts, according to the true design and intention of such settlements. The policy declared by the Board of Trade was a clear statement of intent to eradicate America's hopes for developing the continent. The report went beyond what the Crown thought could then be enforced, but more than a decade of tightening imperial rule had already led to the actual reduction of key colonial populations for the first time in their history. The two major colonies, Massachusetts and Virginia, both declined in free population during the decade from 1690 to 1700. Including immigration, Massachusetts had grown by approximately 50% during each of the decades from 1640 to 1670. The rate of increase dropped to 33% during the 1670s, the period of King Philip's War. During the 1680s, when the Crown launched its all-out campaign to destroy the Massachusetts Charter, the growth rate fell to 25%. Following the direct imposition of royal rule in the 1690s, the population of Massachusetts declined from 49,500 to 48,500. Connecticut, while still managing a net increase in population, suffered the lowest rate of growth in its history. There is a special irony in the Virginia case. After the Stuart Restoration in 1660, Virginia never reached the dramatic growth rates that Massachusetts maintained until the Andros dictatorship. During the 1680s, the free population of Virginia increased only by 7.5%, from 40,500 to 43,700, while slavery took hold for the first time on a major scale, with the number of slaves tripling to over 9,300. But during the 1690s, a decade typically characterized by historians of Virginia as peaceful, unusually prosperous, and smoothly administered, the free population declined 3.5% to 42,170, and slavery expanded by another 75% to more than 16,000. Presiding over this alleged upturn was Sir Edmund Andros, royal governor from 1692 to 1697, who had been reassigned to crush another colony, only 3 years after being driven from office in Massachusetts by force of arms. Isn't it clear that it is the royals that are forcing the slave system into America? It's not the Puritans. It's not the common people that came here to found a new world. It is the empire forcing the slavery system into our world. The danger of America's dwindling away to nothing, as Cotton Mather warned in 1696, intensified after 1700 under simultaneous oligarchical assaults from England and France. For the existing colonies, survival required steering a narrow course between English attempts at political subjugation and French military threats to their frontiers. In 1699, Pierre Le Moyne, Sieur d'Iberville, planted the French flag on the lower Mississippi, and within a year, the claim took on a more ominous character, with the French concluded an alliance with the Choctaw Nation. With these additions to the French settlements and Indian alliances in Canada and the Great Lakes, America's colonial frontier was now threatened along an arc running from the Gulf of Mexico to the mouth of Quebec's St. Lawrence River. In 1700, the colonial legislature of New York reacted with alarm to the French and Indian menace by passing a bill aimed at Jesuit priests, quote, who by their wicked and subtle insinuations industriously labor to debauch, seduce, and withdraw the Indians from their due obedience unto his most sacred majesty. Their fears increased when in 1701 the Iroquois Five Nations, previously the only significant allies among Indians of the Northwest, signed a treaty with both England and France. Their agreement acknowledged English sovereignty in New York, but pledged the Indians to neutrality in any future Anglo-French war. The net result gave France a free hand in launching Indian attacks against the American colonies of the Northeast, especially after England and Holland declared war on France and Spain in 1702. The war made New England a target, both from within and without. Iroquois neutrality enabled the French to ignore New York and concentrate their Indian raids on Massachusetts. And in 1702, the Crown appointed a new governor for Massachusetts, none other than Joseph Dudley, the former servant of the hated Andros regime. French Jesuit agents incited the Abenaki Indians of eastern Maine to raid settlements as close as 40 miles west of Boston. In February 1704, the established frontier settlement at Deerfield was leveled and over 40% of its population taken captive to Quebec. In 1708, French Indians carried out another Deerfield-style massacre in the town of Haverhill, only 30 miles northwest of Boston. Profiteers in New York, meanwhile, used Iroquois neutrality to build up a lucrative fur trade. New Englanders charged, however, that New York provided arms and safe passage for Indian war parties en route to attack the New England frontier. Thomas Hutchinson, in his 18th century book, The History of the Colony and Province of Massachusetts Bay, reported that sometimes the plunder became merchandise in Albany. Governor Dudley, meanwhile, added considerably to the plundering of Massachusetts. Following the declaration of war against France, the English government refused to deploy any significant naval forces against the French in American waters. Thus, by 1705, France was able to knock out 140 ships of Massachusetts, the shipbuilding power of the American colonies. Under pressure to counter such enemy attacks, Governor Dudley joined with a group of merchants in Boston to hire his own vessel, supposedly to raid French ships and carry wartime supplies. Like Captain Kidd some years before, Dudley's captain turned pirate and attacked Boston's ships and sailors. When this Captain Quelch was finally captured and taken to England for trial, Dudley pulled strings to have him pardoned. In 1706, the treasonous Dudley gave flags of truce to Boston merchant vessels, ostensibly for use on missions to exchange prisoners with the French. Instead, they were used to sell supplies and ammunitions to French and Indian forces in Canada. The Massachusetts General Court convicted the merchants of high crimes and only under extreme pressure stopped short of charging Governor Dudley. Dudley and his son Paul, the newly appointed Attorney General of Massachusetts, appealed the convictions in England, where the Privy Council threw them out on a technicality. Boston's merchants were also working against the population at home. Elisha Cook's patron, Andrew Belcher, who profited massively in grain sales to the Royal Navy, at the same time created an acute grain shortage for Massachusetts. In the face of popular opposition to his actions, Belcher retaliated by raising grain prices to impossible heights and hoarded even more grain for profiteering. The increasing oligarchical grip over Massachusetts was extended to its shipbuilding and ocean-going commerce, once the pride of its sovereign years. In 1711, Elisha Cook, heir to his father's political machine, joined with his brother-in-law Daniel Oliver and Andrew Belcher's son-in-law Oliver Noyes to construct Long Wharf, expanding the facilities for Boston's new breed of merchants. The Cook machine then secured for this unholy trio exclusive rights to all the shops and warehouses on the wharf for the next 40 years. In the midst of this rampage against Massachusetts, Paul Dudley began writing appeals to London for authority to create special courts without juries, complete executive power over legislation, and revocation of the charter secured by Increase Mather in 1692. Besieged militarily, economically, and politically, New England had a growing list of reasons to concur with Cotton Mather's assessment that it was becoming, quote, little every way. Without creating new institutions to restore the minds and morality of the population, the chance of securing a whole continent for development appeared nearly, if not already, lost. Well, that's the end of chapter 3. And my point about the theological subversion, I think, is something that I want to emphasize about in my own experience, that it's been a struggle for me to talk to certain people in my family, and a lot of it to me is is the difference between someone who will rely on a church like the Anglican Church for their guidance in morality, and somebody who tries to develop a conscience based on, their childhood and what the goodness that you learn from growing up. And hopefully, these kind of differences can be overcome with the will to overcome them. But to accept things like the fundamentalists of of the 50s, for instance, or the the screaming crazy conversion experiences of, I found Jesus and start sweating and dancing and everything, that stuff, I never really realized that it might be being instigated by the force behind the force behind the force, the people that are, really manipulating us from a perspective of decades and hundreds of years. And there's where it's hard to sell other people on the idea that, wow, could they really be doing this over 300 years, from 1620, 1640, 1660 to now? Is it possible that that same type of a scheme could be applied to controlling humanity? And the answer is yes, it's exactly the same thing. As we see in so many ways, they use the same methods, they use the same people, same lies. And now we're facing this overt population control effort that's going on right now. And we have to face the idea that these things are planned. These things are not spontaneous. These things don't just happen. And we've got to turn over the rock and look underneath and see where the actual root causes are of the poisoning of our planet, the destruction of our genetic heritage, the destruction of our food supplies, the poisoning of our water. Where is this coming from? We've got to get a hold of it, and we've got to make it stop. So thank you very much for joining me this morning for this reading from H. Graham Lowry's book, How the Nation Was Won. And hope returns to our story next time in chapter 4, when we read about Jonathan Swift, and Swift opens the door to the West. The best kept secret of American history is that the crucial opportunity to rekindle the beacon of hope was provided by the brilliant satirist Jonathan Swift, Ireland's Republican leader, who transformed the political rules of the game. Well, we'll read about that the next time. Okay, time to go and get a little something to eat and get ready for the Biden Belton Road Show with George Webb and Wayne Madsen at noon Eastern Time.